consort, as well as extended members of the royal family, including the Prince and Princess of Wales and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, and then a rota of chaplains to the King, who were formally appointed by the Queen, will keep watch over the coffin while it rests in the bow room in private before the big ceremonial procession tomorrow, Nigel, where it is transported in a gun carriage from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Hall to lie in state.
Yes, the extraordinary thing, I thought, looking at the programming for tomorrow, the extraordinary thing, Mark White, I thought, was when I read that the gun carriage will leave the gates of Buckingham Palace at 2:22 p.m. And I saw today soldiers out with pace sticks. I mean, clearly, they've actually got tomorrow worked out to the nearest minute and the nearest 10 paces.
They have, and they absolutely, we know, will stick to that time, as they have over the last few nights, Nigel, in the early hours of the morning, been out walking that parade route, some in full uniform, some of the time not in full uniform, but pacing it out, checking sometimes with horses, sometimes with bands and muffled drums, so as not to wake the few residents around here. We should say that the State hearse now coming down towards Hyde Park Corner, where I'm sure that our colleague Jeff Moody is ready and prepared to capture these images as the outriders pass Hyde Park Corner.
Jeff Moody, can I get you? No, I can't connect with him. Probably signal problems, but there is, we can now for the first time clearly see the Queen's coffin in the hearse, and as it goes around Hyde Park Corner, police, soldiers bow their heads, and the crowd stands, much as they have been for the last few days, in stillness and silence under their umbrellas. So we are just a few minutes away, a couple of minutes away, I'd have thought, from Buckingham Palace. Mark, back on that, or Cameron, whichever one of you. So we're going to hear tonight at some point where people should assemble if they want to attend the lying in state. Do we know what time that statement's going to come?
The lying in state statement perhaps will come at some point this evening, Nigel, but I think for now the focus is on Her Majesty the Queen's coffin arriving at Buckingham Palace. We have just seen the first police motorbike outriders appear around the Victoria Memorial here outside Buckingham Palace.
I could just see the State hearse coming into view here. We're going to pause clearly as a mark of respect as the State hearse carrying the body of Queen Elizabeth II pulls down towards Buckingham Palace, and you can listen to the crowds.
It's great round here.
Surprised me, but given the size of the crowd, not many of them, it seemed to me, were doing that. Some are, maybe more are now. And there's a much broader round of applause now coming in. Cameron Walker, had you expected this applause to break out like this?
I hadn't, Nigel. You could hear a pin drop just before the hearse came into view, and I think it was pretty spontaneous. And in fact, I certainly wasn't expecting, and I don't think a majority of people here were expecting the state hearse to do a loop around the Victoria Memorial. So the thousands of people who have gathered on the Mall and around the memorial, as many people as possible could get a good view of Her Majesty the Queen's coffin. As I mentioned earlier, the coffin has been specifically, the state hearse has been specifically designed so the public can get a good view of Her Majesty the Queen before the state hearse took Her Majesty through the central gates here at Buckingham Palace into the forecourt to be taken into via the state entrance to the ballroom. But yes, spontaneous applause, Nigel, perhaps appropriate for such a historic occasion.
Yes, perhaps it was. I must say, I was surprised by it, but there we are. I suppose one starts, everybody starts, and it's, I suppose, almost an emotional outpouring as people have sat there, stood there, getting wet and being very, very sombre. So the Queen has re-entered the gates of Buckingham Palace for the last time. It is a very historic moment, and even though people clap, they did so, as I say, out of a sense of relief. It is really a very, very sombre moment. She's taken her last flight. She's entered Buckingham Palace for the last time. She will leave Buckingham Palace at 2:22 tomorrow afternoon, and there will begin 4 days and nights of the Queen lying in state. That's it from me, Nigel Farage. I'll hand you over now for the rest of the evening to Patrick Christys.
Yes, hello everybody and welcome along. I am Patrick Christys, standing in for Mark Steyn here on GB News. We have just seen Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II pulling in there to Buckingham Palace for the final time, a deeply, deeply emotional occasion. People there, well-wishers and people looking to soak in what is a historic day in Britain's national history. Spontaneous applause breaking out. I must admit, I was taken aback by the amount of people who appeared to be watching it through their camera phones and not soaking it in with their own eyes. But tonight, as the late Queen's coffin has arrived in London ahead of her state funeral next week, we will be reflecting on her final journey from Scotland to Buckingham Palace, where she will now rest until she lays in state at Westminster Hall tomorrow. Our correspondents will have the latest from central London. We'll also be remembering our late monarch with Toby Young, Pandora Forsyth and Sam Ashworth-Hayes, who'll be joining me live here on GB News all the way through until 9 o'clock. We are going to report on the events, but we do want to hear from you as well. Please continue to share your fond memories of the Queen. Let us know if your plans are going to be to go and pay tribute in your own way to her in the coming days. gbviews@gbnews.uk. I, for one, have been immensely touched and humbled, actually, by the amount of people getting in touch to share their memories of our dear Queen, and indeed, of course, as well, what they're going to be doing in the coming days. We've got a lot more coming as well, though. We're not just going to be discussing exactly that journey that's happened there. We're going to be taking a view on freedom of speech. That was obviously a very, very well-attended event that took place there, and indeed a well-respected event. Unfortunately, the same hasn't been the case throughout the country necessarily. We're talking about whether or not people's right to free speech trumps their right, frankly, not to be offensive when it comes to the way that they've been marking the Queen's passing. We're also going to be discussing the very latest announcements from the Sussexes that Prince Harry will not be wearing any military uniform. A lot of people actually saying that he should be able to wear it. He has served for, as the Sussexes statement was at pains to point out, a decade in our armed forces. And inevitably, as Her Majesty the Queen lies there in Buckingham Palace with just her family around her, eventually the focus will shift a little bit towards King Charles. We're going to be looking at how he pays his respects and trying to get to know our new king a little bit better. But for the moment, really, clearly, the right and proper thing to do is to focus on Her Majesty the Queen herself. And we're going to be talking now to Mark White and Cameron Walker, both of whom are in situ at Buckingham Palace for us. I'll start with you, Mark. Thank you very much. Mark White there. I must say I was quite taken aback by the amount of people watching that historic moment through their camera phones. I got a little bit teary-eyed, I don't mind admitting, seeing Her Majesty the Queen pull into Buckingham Palace for the final time. What was that atmosphere like there where you are?
Well, of course, when you see that in the flesh, so to speak, when you catch a glimpse of the State hearse coming round the Victoria Memorial, yes, absolutely, it's moving. There's no doubt. It's interesting and slightly contrasting with the situation in Edinburgh, where we saw, of course, the Queen's coffin, the hearse, processing up the Royal Mile there, and there was pretty much just dead silence. But here it was one of these moments, wasn't it, Cameron, where one or two people let out a little cheer and a little applaud, and then other people obviously thought, okay, it's safe to do it, and it just became a ripple and more of an applause then.
Yeah, when those first police outriders came here to outside the Victoria Memorial, the crowd went very, very silent. You couldn't hear a pin drop. And when they got the first view of the State hearse carrying Her Majesty the Queen's coffin, as you said, applause spontaneously erupted, and then the unexpected situation where the State hearse drove around the Victoria Memorial, so as many people as possible who have gathered here on the Mall, gathered here at Buckingham Palace, could see Her Majesty the Queen's coffin in person. We now know, of course, that the State hearse as well has been designed specifically by a British company, Jaguar Land Rover, in consultation with the royal household, as we've been told, so as many people as possible can see Her Majesty's coffin as it travels through London, as well as on Monday the 19th, travelling up to Windsor to be eventually taken to St George's Chapel.
And Patrick, what was lovely in terms of the landing of this flight carrying the late monarch at RAF Northolt is that that's some 15 miles from Buckingham Palace, so really an opportunity on that route in this specially designed State hearse for members of the public to have an opportunity to see and pay their respects to the late monarch, because much of the focus, understandably, because this is protocol, since the Queen died at Balmoral on Scottish soil, we had a good 2 or 3 days of ceremonial duties in Scotland itself, in the Scottish capital, but now that focus has really shifted to the capital of the United Kingdom, and what we will see, of course, apart from what we have here today, the coffin coming to Buckingham Palace, is that we'll have that very solemn procession to Westminster Hall tomorrow afternoon, which again will be watched by many thousands of people.
Absolutely, both of you. Thank you very much. Mark White there and Cameron Walker just outside Buckingham Palace, where Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has made her final journey through those famous gates. Now, mourners have filled the streets of London waiting to pay their respects to Her late Majesty. We saw and indeed heard many of them there as spontaneous applause rippled out. But, unfortunately, protesters have also been taking to the streets in the wake of the Queen's death. The Metropolitan Police made it clear in a statement that people have a right to protest, but some officers have been branded overzealous for handling demonstrators with arrests, etc. With me now to discuss the events of the day, but also not ignoring, certainly, some of the more annoying social issues that have taken place. It's Toby Young, social commentator and General Secretary of the Free Speech Union. Very firstly, Toby, your initial thoughts there, a very moving and emotional setting there as the Queen did a loop around the outside of Buckingham Palace, just the entrance there, and then went into spontaneous applause. I got a bit teary-eyed. I imagine you were emotional as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the really remarkable things in the past few days is, I think, an older, gentler, patriotic Britain has emerged. A lot of us had thought that Britain had disappeared in much the same way that Putin thought that the West didn't any longer have the confidence to stand up for its values and defend a country like Ukraine in the teeth of the Russian invasion. Turns out, a lot of these traditional values are there just beneath the surface. We don't hear much about them because the people who shout the loudest
Toby, that's a fantastic point, Toby. It's a fantastic point, and I want to expand on that a little bit, because as we see images of the outside of Buckingham Palace there, crowds now starting to filter away. But right across the United Kingdom, we've seen people gathering to pay their respects and to also commend our new king, King Charles III. And all too often in this country, Toby, we're hearing a very, very vocal, shouty and frankly annoying minority of people either waving a certain type of flag potentially or saying that we all need to be woke these days. But actually, the silent majority does believe in good British traditional values, don't they?
I think that's right, yes. And I've been really pleasantly surprised by how enthusiastic people have been about our new king. You know, I think, like a lot of people, I was slightly concerned about the future of the monarchy after the Queen passed on, thinking that Charles might not be able to command the same public affection, the same universal respect that the Queen commanded. But actually, it turns out that people are really welcoming and enthusiastic about King Charles III. And, you know, any anxieties I had about the future of the monarchy in his hands, I think, were misplaced.
Do you think this will put some people back in their place, as it were, people who think that we do need to constantly be, quotes unquote, progressive, because in some ways I would argue that's a little bit regressive in the way that we seem to be going about it now? This is an opportunity, and hopefully an opportunity anyway, that I think will give people confidence to say, actually, hang on a minute, I am a royalist, I do believe in Britain and a certain version of Britain, and it doesn't need to be constantly changing.
Yeah, I hope it does give people who believe in traditional British values, who feel patriotic, who care about the monarchy, who want to put Britain first. I hope it does make them feel a little bit more self-confident and a little bit less afraid to speak up and articulate what they believe and not have to look over their shoulders for fear that they'll be called, regressive. But one thing we need to bear in mind too, Patrick, is that, you know, there is still a small minority who don't like the monarchy, who would prefer Britain to be a republic. And even though, you know, their timing, if they're articulating those sentiments now, as some of them have been, in the form of protests, holding up signs, etc., even though their timing's terrible, and most of us have no sympathy with their views, nonetheless, we should defend their right to free speech. That is one of the things that makes this country a great country. It's one of the things the Queen stood for. And it's quite wrong, you know, however offensive and annoying we might find those people and what they're saying. Nonetheless, they have a right to set out what they believe, just as everyone else does, and that should be defended. And it's quite wrong of the police to have been arresting and in some cases charging these protesters. We need to stand up for their right to free speech precisely because we believe in traditional British values.
Well, Toby, I must admit I've gone full circle on this, and yes, I am emotional. I'm emotional at the moment because of what we've just witnessed there, our dear Queen making her final journey through those gates of Buckingham Palace, and the idea for me that anyone would want to use this particular moment in time to shout obscenities, no matter what people think, for example, of Prince Andrew, and a lot of those criticisms are valid in my view, the idea that anyone would shout at anyone as they walk just yards behind their mother's coffin. I went, Toby, from, I'll just say this, I don't mind, thinking I wouldn't mind if these people were almost taken out on sight, which is wrong, by the way, I was just emotionally charged, to being like, OK, well, they have got a right to say it. I am now in the position of, I actually further defend their right to say it, not because just on the free speech grounds, Toby, but on the fact that I think they're actually actively damaging their cause and showing their true nasty side. And free speech principles aside, that's another reason to let them crack on, because they're not going to be the winners here.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that's actually a really powerful argument, Patrick, for defending people's right to free speech, including those who you profoundly disagree with. You know, if we might really disapprove of a point of view, but if we suppress it, if we punish people for expressing it, then we're deprived of the opportunity of making our counter-arguments, of making the case for the other side. And often, you know, if you suppress these unorthodox and unfashionable points of view. It gives them a kind of underground glamour, and they don't deserve that. People should be entitled to set out their point of view, however toxic and offensive it is, in the public square, so people like you and I can engage them in robust debate, challenge those views, and hopefully persuade most people to reject them.
There is a slight counter, though, here, isn't there? I'm keen to get your view on this, because the role of the monarch, and we don't want to detract at the moment from what is the main issue at the minute, which is, of course, that the Queen has just made her final journey into Buckingham Palace. But the shift in focus will inevitably turn to King Charles III at some point in the coming days. And on the issue of free speech, King Charles has been criticised in the past for perhaps being a little bit vocal, maybe some would say political, certainly when it came to the environment. But now in his role as monarch, he doesn't have free speech, does he?
No, I think he does need to be careful, Patrick. I think in the past, he has said things that if he said now that he's king, might erode the authority and dignity of the crown. I mean, I'm thinking in particular of his enthusiastic embrace of the green agenda and net zero. I think in the past that was less politically contentious than it is now that we're seeing some of the impact of the net zero green policies or things like energy bills. And the Conservative Party seems to be departing under Liz Truss a little bit from the broad cross-party consensus on those issues. She said that she may, under certain circumstances, lift the fracking ban. She's asked one of her ministers to review the manner in which we're trying to achieve net zero by 2050. So it looks as though that is becoming a much more politically contentious issue. And I think, if Charles wants to maintain the universal respect and authority of our constitutional monarchy, he has to avoid entering into that kind of political contentious debate. And I hope he has the good sense to do that, and I expect he does.
I actually wonder whether or not that King Charles, as it were, or certain members of the royal family have actually been afraid to speak freely in the past, and whether or not the environmental agenda, I know that the royal family have had a long-standing environmental, not agenda, but passion for environmental causes, I should say. But when it comes to things like the running of the country or the nature of the country, potentially issues to do with things like immigration or traditional values, as you and I were talking about earlier, whether ironically their freedom of speech was curtailed in that regard, and they go maybe too far the other way, as we see in society now, people too afraid to maybe stand up for what they actually believe in for fear of being shouted down at a dinner party or heckled on Twitter.
Well, I think the difficulty for members of the royal family is that whatever they say is going to be interpreted as a point of view being expressed by a member of this particular institution. It's very difficult for them to, take off that hat and just appear as an ordinary private citizen expressing their view about a political issue. At all times, they represent something which to, the vast majority of Britons is incredibly precious and important, almost sacred. And so they have to, I think, be very mindful of what they say so they don't in any way tarnish that institution that is so beloved. And I'm afraid, unless they want to leave the royal family altogether, and Prince Harry certainly seems to be heading in that direction, then they don't have the freedom to speak out and express their point of view on politically contentious issues. They have to remain above the fray, because otherwise they risk alienating some of us who don't agree with those points of view.
Toby Young, thank you very much. Social commentator and General Secretary of the Free Speech Union there. He mentioned Prince Harry. Now, as we have just seen, very moving tributes paid by a crowd there to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II making her final journey into Buckingham Palace. Actually, there was an announcement that came out just about an hour and a half ago from the Sussexes. The Duke of Sussex, Prince Harry, has been banned from wearing his military uniform at the events commemorating his grandmother, the Queen's, life. However, his uncle Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, will be allowed to wear his uniform at the vigil. Harry, of course, now will not. Prince Harry's press team have since spoken out, that didn't take them long, stating that his decision will not, or this decision, I should say, will not erase his decades' worth of military service. But with me now to talk through this is Pandora Forsyth, the host of the Daily Express's Royal Roundup podcast. Yes, it's an interesting announcement. This. Hello, thank you very much for joining me. An interesting announcement, this. Do you think it's right that Prince Harry will be banned from wearing anything military-related, whereas Prince Andrew can?
I think that Prince Harry knew the risks when he stepped down as being a senior royal, and he took a big risk by doing that. And one of the things that he would have been briefed on would have been his military attire that he would wear to official royal engagements. This is something that would not have been a surprise to him. As we've already seen, and it's already been mentioned, all of the Queen's arrangements for her funeral would have come into discussion, and the whole of the royal family would have been briefed about this beforehand. Obviously, as the public, we hear this later on than they do, of course. At the end of the day, they're still a private family. But this would have been no surprise to them, certainly.
Do you think it's what the public would want to see, almost like a visible dressing down of Prince Harry following his decision to, some would say, I suppose, trash the royal family?
I think that Harry and Meghan do divide people. We have seen this. I mean, as soon as you talk about this, you'd know yourself. You seem to be met by two separate sides of the argument. So therefore, I think it's important at this specific occasion, in the fact that we are, in national mourning, that we do respect the funeral and everything that happens around it. However, if this was another royal occasion, perhaps I'd be saying something a bit different. I think the public is always split on Harry and Meghan, and within the next coming years, I think it will be very interesting to see whether they still stay across the pond or they do come back to the UK. We saw the pictures the other day of what we used to know as the Fab Four together, and they seemed, apart from one woman in the crowd, from what I saw from the camera angles, they seemed to be met, the Sussexes and the now new Prince and Princess of Wales, with respect, and joy that they were there.
Can I just say on that, you are correct. There was one lady who essentially gave Meghan the cold shoulder. But I will say that I think that speaks volumes more about British qualities, about politeness and dignity and respect, than it does about a changing of public attitudes towards Harry and Meghan. Your views on that? Oh, no views on that, apparently. There we go, unfortunately. OK, well, there we go. Oh, you're back. You're back. Sorry, you dropped off. Carry on. Continue. Sorry, we lost you for a second, but you're back.
I think it would be very interesting to see if this happened somewhere else. I think the fact that they were in Windsor and the crowd were royalists, and they were all paying their respects. If this happened anywhere else, I think perhaps it might have been a bit different. But there is a reason why we don't know all about the security arrangements and the private meetings, etc., purely based on the fact that we don't know what the public reaction will be when they get there. We were not briefed on this as journalists, as you well know, that this reunion on camera would happen so publicly. We weren't briefed that they would be coming, and of course that brings into question the security argument that has been happening. But yes, I think perhaps if we would have known, perhaps the crowd's reaction would have been a bit different.
I just think it throws all of the myths about the fact that they might not be safe in this country, the security detail they needed. I thought that was, frankly, thrown into disarray, really, and showed them to be quite disingenuous. And I know that we're talking about it now, but we're talking about it because this is news that broke just about an hour or so ago about Prince Harry's attire at the funeral. So I do want to talk about it. We are a news channel. I want to reflect the news, and also it's an issue that I know a lot of people feel very, very passionately about. And I think the idea as well that Prince Harry needs extra security, if that is indeed true, may be more to do with his own actions than anything else. I mean, the idea that he's not even going to postpone this book. Dan Wootton, I believe, last night, right here on this very channel, was discussing the fact that he's been pushing to try to get it out in November. What we saw from the British public when they met up with Harry and Meghan was respect, was dignity, was class. Haven't they behaved pretty classlessly?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely were met with respect and class, and everybody who was there. You know, he is also in mourning. Let's bear this in mind. He's had a very close relationship, with the Queen, and perhaps that has come strained under recent years. It goes without saying. However, we have to think back before the days where he was married, and we have to think about the fact that, you know, he did lose his mother, so he was particularly close with the Queen, and it was only on the Tuesday where we saw her meeting our new Prime Minister, and it was only 2 days later. What the royal family knew about her health will obviously be very different to the public in terms of minute by minute. But we did all see them rushing to get there. And of course, Harry was later than the others.
I'm going to just have one more with you, if that's OK, before we go to get some public reaction from Jeff Moody, who's actually just nearby, near Buckingham Palace, speaking to people. Let's just talk a little bit about King Charles now, King Charles III, because this is going to be a private moment, a rare private moment for King Charles to have some alone time with his mother and actually pay his respects alone, isn't it?
Yes, it certainly is. And he has been on public display, publicly mourning and grief, and also doing now royal duty. We've seen him, get straight back to business, and I'm sure his late mother would have absolutely been in line with that with her 70 years of service. We have seen that, but now he has a private moment away from the cameras. Also, with his closest relatives are all around there at the moment in Buckingham Palace. So yes, I think this will be a very special moment for him, and it won't be so public, and he hopefully will be able to actually let it all sink in. I don't think for him, he's not had a minute to breathe. No. So I think this will be a very poignant moment for him.
Indeed. Pandora Forsyth there, thank you very much. Pandora there, the host of the Daily Express's Royal Roundup podcast, I should say. Let's cross over now to our reporter, Jeff Moody, who's at Hyde Park Corner. The Queen's coffin passed through there not long ago, and we spoke to Jeff earlier on, and there's been people gathering there since early on today to pay their respects. Jeff, I can see that you're with somebody there now. Please talk to me about what's going on.
I am indeed. Well, the crowds here were 15, 20 deep. It was amazing how people just came from all over, and suddenly there were people everywhere. And then just around 8 o'clock, there was a hush. And in that hush, the hearse came from round past the Dorchester, round Hyde Park Corner and down Constitution Hill. It was all very quick. We've waited a very long time today for that, and in the blinking of an eye, it was over. But what a moment! Natasha, you were here to see it.
I
you
was.
had a bit of an experience trying to get a good position, didn't you? What happened?
Did. I managed to leave work early and ran all the way around to the other side of the palace, and then found out that we weren't allowed to stay there. So got ushered on, ended up halfway up Pall Mall to realise it wasn't coming down Pall Mall today. So I had to literally run through Green Park around, and I was quite lucky. I got snuck in a little bit by the pillar. So I managed to get here literally about 2 minutes after being an hour early.
And, well, I'm glad you got here in the end for that. What was it like for you? Because the coffin would have gone right past where you were, wasn't it? What was it like?
I absolutely loved it. I wanted to come. I wanted to be here. Emotional as well. I think for someone, especially my generation, like that's all we've ever known is the Queen. So just wanting to come and pay respects, and it was weird as half cheering, half hush. We weren't really quite sure what to do, but I'm really glad I got there. I'm really glad I saw it.
So am I. And I thought it was interesting, didn't you, that suddenly everyone started applauding. Everyone was clapping.
Yeah, after she'd gone, bit of a moment to kind of take it all in, see what had happened, and then everyone kind of broke out in applause, which I think was quite fitting. Just to round it off, applaud and I guess say thank you in a way. And
how's it been for you since the news? How are you?
I'm okay. I was surprised at the level of emotion And I think the level of grief that you don't really expect yourself to feel.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think we feel like that?
The only thing I can guess is just that she was a constant. She was an amazing female figurehead in a time that, you know, she did so many things that she wanted to do, and she helped everything, and she was a very kind, very caring lady. And I think it's sad to lose someone of that stature, that status, and who means so much to so many people around the world.
And it feels very strange, doesn't it, that we're all feeling this together. Yeah. We're all in this together, aren't we?
We're all generations. My nanny is 96 and she looks exactly like the Queen. So I must admit, when she passed, I rang my nan just to check. And maybe that's it as well. Maybe, you know, she's kind of the granny of the nation. And I think that might be why brought it all together. So I'm glad I got to see it. That's what I wanted. I wanted to see it. So.
And it's lovely to do that with all of these other people, isn't it? To be part of that moment. That's a moment that you'll never forget now, isn't it?
No, and that's why I wanted to come, and also to be surrounded by not just British people. I was stood halfway down Pall Mall next to some Canadians and some Americans, and it's really nice that everybody wants to turn up and that everybody wants to be here and to see it and to experience it in their own way. And I don't feel like you have to be big supporters of the monarchy. I think everyone can just appreciate that she put in her lifelong service. And that's a long time, 70 years. So I'm really glad. I was going to be gutted if I missed it running through Green Park. So I'm really glad I got here. I saw it. So I'm happy now. I feel like it's complete now. So
do you feel like this is giving you a little bit of closure, do you think?
In a weird way, yeah. I'm working tomorrow, so I'm going to miss obviously the whole procession tomorrow, which is a bit gutting. So I think today was my opportunity to get that closure and to get that experience, to see her at least. So, yeah.
Well, Natasha, thank you very, very much indeed for I'm so pleased that you finally managed to see it after your run through Green Park. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, yes, you know, as you can see, the emotion in people's voices there. There's been so many people coming away from that ceremony crying. When I say ceremony, I mean that ceremonial moment, in a way, as you suddenly see the hearse coming towards you, and you suddenly realise that you're part of that. And I think for many people, initially there was that shock, that huge sense of shock when it happened, and disbelief. I mean, I spent several days waking up thinking, is this true? Is this real? And weird, isn't it, that she's 96 and we knew that she wouldn't go on forever, but it still felt like a real shock. And I think seeing that she's arrived back in London. This is the first time that the hearse the coffin has been in England, hasn't it? It's arrived back in England. She's now at her constitutional home, Buckingham Palace. And I think this is the first moment for a lot of people seeing that coffin when we realise that it's true. The Queen has gone.
Jeff, thank you.
And I think that's going to be very sad for a lot of people.
It is. Jeff, thank you. And can I just say thank you very much there for what I think was an incredibly powerful interview with a wonderful lady there. I think she was called Natasha, who really encapsulated, I believe anyway, the country's emotions, that desire, that pull to go and be there, a compulsion to go and be there, an unbelievably emotional experience it must have been. And can I just also add that I think that it's really refreshing, and I think our viewers and our listeners will be reassured, actually, as we've discussed the future of this country post Queen Elizabeth II, to know that there are people like Natasha who are of a slightly younger age, perhaps, than the many royalists, as it were. And I think it really does show that this country's in safe hands. Jeff, thank you very much, especially for braving the elements for us there. Jeff Moody, reporting from Hyde Park Corner on what is a deeply, deeply emotional day. That road there just behind Jeff, where the Queen made her final journey to Buckingham Palace, where she will now remain overnight, accompanied just by her immediate family. We understand that the staff there at Buckingham Palace will be given their opportunity to pay their own respects, but also to King Charles III now, Princess Anne, and other members, immediate members of the royal family, to actually have a bit of time to grieve in private. They are almost state property, aren't they, in a way? Our royal family, they are, really. And I think we talk a lot about service and duty, and perhaps one of their greatest services, and King Charles's greatest service, will be the fact that we as a nation have shared in his grief with him from the start. And you at home have been sending us your thoughts and memories of our late Queen, and thank you very much for that. Mel has been on, says, if Her Majesty anticipated that her time was very short, what a perfect decision to go to her beloved Scotland, a massive unification move to tie Scotland closer to the monarchy. If that was Her Majesty's intention, she really did it perfectly as an apolitical icon. God bless the Queen. Mel, I have a sneaky suspicion, I will never know the answer to this, and we don't necessarily want to speculate too much, but given that you brought it up, Mel, I do have a sneaky suspicion that the Queen will have known that time was drawing in, and that actually to go to Scotland, one of her favourite residences for a start, but also the impact that that will have now, I believe, on the unification of the nation. Many people were there thinking maybe this is the time now that we can break up the UK, maybe this is the time now that we can go for an independent Scotland, where we can stoke Republican views or whatever, and actually the opposite has been true. And perhaps in her final act, Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II has yet again saved Britain and saved the United Kingdom. Beverly has also had this to say: so fed up with advisory voices everywhere, prophesying doom. Yes, here we go. The huge crowd will be made up by patriots, British citizens who loved the Queen. They are not going to be a problem. Look on them as 1 million reserve security guards. Yeah, OK. Again, something, actually, I think it was Bev, was it? I did get a lot of pleasure after watching that, I can't say the word, get absolutely dealt with in the crowd when he decided to pipe up. I'm not a massive fan of Prince Andrew. Now's not the time to go into all of those details, of course. I'm not a massive fan of Prince Andrew for the obvious reasons. However, I think when you start shouting at someone when they're walking yards behind their mother's coffin, you deserve what you get. There we go. Bonnie's been on. Simple message here from Bonnie, apparently. Well done, Your Majesty. Your work here is done. Very powerful, Bonnie. Thank you very much for that wonderful message. Well, GB News' correspondent Mark White is at Buckingham Palace. Let's go from Hyde Park Corner to Buckingham Palace. Keep your views coming in, by the way, everybody. GBviews at gbnews.uk. Mark, we heard there an incredibly moving piece from Jeff Moody and a wonderful lady called Natasha, who queued up for ages, had to move, was kind of pushed and pulled around a little bit in order to get that glimpse of Her Majesty the Queen as she made that final trip to Buckingham Palace, which is where you are now. And as we understand it, she's going to be there where King Charles III can grieve privately for his mother.
Pay their respects here, who have queued for an awful long time to try to get to an area like here around Buckingham Palace, and will queue in the coming days, of course, to also look at areas and events such as the Queen's final journey heading towards, of course, Westminster Hall, where she will lie in state before then the funeral at Westminster Abbey. Now, in terms of those people, what we is that actually in the coming days the crowds are going to get even bigger, understandably. So, for instance, the queues to get into the viewing of Her Majesty lying in state are likely to be many, many hours before you can get anywhere near Westminster. We believe that they will potentially snake back as far as Bermondsey in southeast London. That's a contingency that the police and the other emergency services are making. So the very poignant story of that particular woman who wanted to get as close as she could and, you know, was being frustrated in those attempts, I'm afraid will be repeated many, many times because there are so many people that want to come and clearly see Her Majesty lying in state, but also to be there for the state funeral, to be there tomorrow when that coffin is put on top the gun carriage and processed up the Mall behind me, over to Horse Guards, onto Whitehall, and down to the Palace of Westminster. That will be incredibly moving, especially as we will see once again senior members of the royal family processing behind the gun carriage, including, of course, the Queen's children, but not just the Queen's children. Of course, in Edinburgh, it was effectively just the Queen's children who were walking behind that coffin as it went up the Royal Mile. What we'll see tomorrow afternoon will be many more members of the royal family, including, we're told, the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Sussex, amongst other senior royals who will want to embark on that journey up the Mall, as I say, across the Horse Guards and down to Parliament. Another opportunity, as I say, for many thousands of people coming into central.
Yeah. Absolutely. Mark, thank you very much. Mark White there, who's been discussing the fact that obviously what's going to happen in the coming days. Mark White, our home and security editor, thank you very much. Well, joining me in the studio now is Spectator columnist Sam Ashworth-Hayes, who actually put forward a very impassioned and erudite case for the monarchy in his blog yesterday, and I think it's very fitting that we do that now. I'm keen to try to do a counter to some of the fact that, well, the cesspit voices that we keep seeing at sometimes on Twitter and on social media. And he's with me here now in the studio, as I said, to discuss how the monarchy functions as a living link to our past, why that matters, and most importantly, what role Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II played in that. Sam, thank you very much for joining us. And a really, really fitting interjection, this, a nice antidote, a tonic to some of the idiots, frankly, who I've been seeing out there at the minute. Excuse me if I'm a bit emotional. I am emotional. It's an emotional day. But just to discuss to us everything I've just said there, really, why it's so important to have this monarchy.
Of course, I'm very happy to. So there are lots of arguments that are sort of put forward for the British monarchy. Generally, you hear people say, oh, if we get rid of it, we'll lose some minute fraction of tourist revenue. You have people who raise practical objections. They say, if you get rid of the monarchy, you'll have to re-examine our constitution. We'll have to decide who the head of state is going to be. There are some more subtle arguments where people say, well, people look up to their leaders, they sort of merge them with the nation in their head, and it's not healthy to do that with an elected leader, because that's how you get the Americans being slightly weird about their presidents, which we've managed to avoid with the office of Prime Minister. And I think these are all good arguments, and I think they all have merit. But for me, the thing that really matters is that the monarchy is a living link with Britain's past. This is 1,000 years of tradition and history, going, well, beyond that actually, but going back from 1066 to today. You can look at this thread, this unbroken thread that has been a constant in each of our lives and our ancestors' lives all the way back through British history. And it's part of a fabric, an increasingly thin fabric, which connects us with our past. And I think there's something really important in that. The idea that you could go back to a point in history, look at things and say, that is recognisably the England of today. Yeah. And equally, you could go forward 1,000 years into the future, Britain would still have a monarchy, and you could say, there is something which links me to the Britain that I've come from.
It absolutely sickens me, the idea that, as you've just said there, 1,000 years of British monarchical history could be snuffed out by some teenager with pink hair, a rainbow tattoo on their face and a Che Guevara T-shirt on. I mean, it makes me feel sick.
I don't think it's going to happen. I think you just have to look. You look at the crowds lining up to pay respect to the Queen. You look at the length of the queue. I have people asking me, how do I go and see her? How do I go and pay my respects? I think there's a marvellous love for the monarchy and a sort of appreciation for what it does for this country. And I think what this has shown more than anything else is the hollowness of the Republican movement, who make a lot of noise on social media but actually don't have any real support.
They bang on a lot about a colonial past, and we've seen all too much of that, saying, you know, I'm not going to grieve for someone who was responsible for this, that and the other. Is there any merit to that whatsoever?
Well, particularly with regards to Queen Elizabeth, absolutely not, because her entire role was not making decisions of that sort. If you have a head of state who is a politically impartial figure who does not do governance, to attribute to her the sins of colonialism is a very strange thing to do, and particularly because her reign basically saw the dismantling, or the end of the dismantling rather, of Britain's empire. Yeah. So there is no...
There's no basis for that whatsoever, but it's almost become fashionable. And this is one thing that I want to talk to you about, you've alluded to it so far, is the need for tradition, because fashions come and go. And I'm very hopeful that the current fashion, which seems to be, frankly, to despise Britain in a lot of senses. I hope that goes as quickly as it came, but how important is tradition? Why do we need tradition, the royal family ritual?
So I think it's part of a broader thing, which is the sense that society changes over time. Of course it does. And Britain today looks very different to Britain in the year 1000. You just have to think about all the economic, technological, social changes that happened since then. Britain today looks very different from Britain in 1900. But there is a continuity to this. You can see the evolution happen over time. You can see where it's come from. You can see common threads through it. And each time you sever one of those threads, you sever part of your link with your past. And the country which eventually dismantles all of its tradition, which goes completely from a blank slate, I think loses a great deal of its soul.
I agree. I think it's a bit like burning your house down and wondering why you're homeless. It does, seriously. And this obsession with people to focus on some perceived historical negatives as opposed to all of the good things, I think is tasteless and wrong, frankly. But put the case forward there. You have alluded to, I thought you worded that incredibly intelligently, actually, because you made some slightly more minor points about things like tourism that the royal family brings. But your overarching case for the British monarchy, we've got a couple of minutes left with you now. Let's try and drown out some of those voices on social media. Why are you a royalist?
I am simply a royalist because I believe it's the system that best suits Britain. In another country, I might believe in a different system of government entirely, but we have a system that has worked very well for us. We don't have a need to shake it up. It does link us to our past. And I think something that's sort of worth repeating is there's this line G.K. Chesterton wrote, which I love, and he says, Rome was not loved because she was great. Rome became great because men loved her. And I think you have to apply that thinking to Britain. Why was Britain great? Because people love Britain. Why does Britain continue to be great? Because we love it. We love its tradition, we love its history, we love its people. And every time we sever a part of that and we make it some interchangeable parts of the world, completely the same as America, completely the same as somewhere else, we lose some of that love. I think that's important.
I was just outside the studio watching Nigel Farage's show earlier, and he made a point that I thought was fantastic, which is that when you look around Europe and, I suppose, the world in a sense, there are plenty of countries that either used to have a monarchy or have a much diminished monarchy. And I'll just say it, I think the impression is that now they're lesser countries, right? Because actually, when you look at our country and our monarchy, that is a massive thing about making Britain great. And to lose that, I'm sorry, but I do think we're a better country than most of the countries, if not all of them, that have ditched their monarchy.
Well, clearly it's the greatest country in the world. But there's this sort of thing where people get almost too rational about things, and they sort of look at pomp and circumstance and guilt and, you know, all of these sort of wonderfully crafted cathedrals, and they say, well, you could worship in a building made of cinder blocks, you could open Parliament without this ceremony. And you could do those things, but they would be greatly diminished because it's what buys that sort of emotional buy into these things, is their grandeur, is their sort of pomp and circumstance, is the idea that you are doing something which your ancestors did, which their ancestors did, and which you can go back through this chain. And I just think there's a real sort of hollowness to countries which sort of dismantle their traditions and their rituals.
It almost makes it a bit pathetic when you do see, I don't want to dig anyone out, but, you know, I mean, the Spanish monarchy, for example, or various different other ones, you know, these are also rams. These are people who are quite literally being bussed in for our Queen's funeral, which is great. Well, not actually in the case of the King of Spain, but, you know, some of them, they are, and that's fantastic, and it's nice that they pay their respects. But, I mean, the idea that Her Majesty the Queen would ever have got on a bus to go to anyone else's funeral, I think, is laughable, really. I mean, they are the pinnacle. Please don't tell me she's done that at some point now.
I would not be able to comment on whether Her Majesty has ever ridden on a bus or not. I wouldn't want to venture to speculate.
No, exactly. But this is the point, though, and I think, look, just to bring it back to what was probably definitely the main news of the day, which is we were witnessing there, the Queen's final journey into Buckingham Palace. You mentioned a lot about tradition and longevity. The idea that I thought I would ever be live on national television having to talk about Queen Elizabeth II making her final journey through those gates doesn't feel real.
It doesn't. And it's this bizarre thing because you knew intellectually and logically it must happen at some point. People don't live forever, but it didn't feel like something that would happen anytime soon.
I can't believe it has happened, and I know a lot of our viewers and listeners can't either. Can I just ask your overbearing emotions as we come to terms with this loss as a country, and she lies in state, of course, for the next few days, and we build up to the funeral. How do you feel?
I mean, obviously, you sort of feel sorry for the loss, But I think something that's sort of worth saying is this is in part the role of a monarchy, is that when on the demise of a monarch, the transition is immediate. The Queen is dead, long live the King. It's an immediate transition to the new ruler. And that sort of certainty which it provides, I think, is a great comfort in these times.
Indeed, and on King Charles, now being given a bit of time to grieve, I say on his own, one would imagine alongside the Princess Royal, Princess Anne, and potentially some other very close members of the royal family as well. Some much-needed time.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to think of what he must be going through, because obviously we've all experienced personal loss. Very few of us have had to marry that sort of personal loss to stepping up to be the new representative of the nation. So it must be an incredibly difficult period.
You are hopeful, though, that the role of the monarchy, that King Charles can continue this epic legacy, not just of Queen Elizabeth II, but our historical constitutional monarchy as well.
I fully expect him to. I think he'll do a marvellous job.
You think he'll do a marvellous job. Thank you very much. Look, Sam, it's been brilliant to have you on the show, and I really appreciate your views. And I think in this time as well, they are drastically needed, much needed views there from Sam Ashworth-Hayes, who's just put an incredibly impassioned case forward for the monarchy, and that link to history. I don't know about how you feel at home, ladies and gentlemen, but I've said it before, I'll say it again. When we look around now, as we're seeing images of Her Majesty the Queen there making her final journey through London, through those gates at Buckingham Palace, she will lie in state at Westminster Hall from tomorrow, where millions of people, if they're allowed to, it must be said, millions of people are going to be going to go and see Her Majesty the Queen there. We've seen the likes of Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, frankly, everywhere around the world almost, paying their tributes and respects to our dear Queen. The idea that some spotty teenager with pink hair and what they think are radical, rebellious views might be about to bring this institution to its knees and start piping up about a past that they know little of, I find absolutely sickening. I must also say as well, I do find it quite interesting now, and in fact quite disrespectful to our dear Queen, that they're saying that potentially some people might have to be turned away because, quote, London may well be full. Well, I'm sorry, but you can't have it both ways, I'm afraid. I don't mind piping up about it on national television right now. We cannot have a situation, it makes absolutely no logical sense to me to have a situation where we want to visit London, that's the hashtag from our mayor, where we want to welcome absolutely everybody from all over the world on unrelenting amounts of people, left, right and centre. We want more people, we want the world to come here, and then our actual monarch passes away, and all of a sudden they think there's too many people for us all to go and pay respects. I find that incredibly disrespectful, actually. I think as many people as possible should be allowed to go and see the Queen lying in state. They should take as many children as possible so that she lives on, not just through textbooks and history books in schools, but also through the medium of people's retinas, a very lived experience of someone going and visibly paying their respects to our dear Queen. I think that is what needs to happen. But I would just like to